Alright, for our watercolor techniques, I'm going to show you 8 different techniques that you can use. I attached 2 sheets that have a lot more than 8 techniques, so feel free to pick and choose which 8 you would like to do. Doesn't matter to me which 8 you choose, but please have 8. You need watercolors, cup of water, your watercolor paper, some tape, and your brush. If you don't want to mask off your patterns like this, that's fine. I just like the way that it turns out at the end. When I was attaching this tape, I attached it to my shirt so that when I peeled it off at the end, it didn't ruin the paper. So I divided it into 8 sections that I'm going to practice my 8 techniques in, and then I went through and labeled where I was going to practice each of the techniques, so I made sure I had them all. Make sure you have 8. Make sure you know where you're going to put them. When you start, make sure you have a brush that is full and round, that holds water well and holds a lot of water. I'm going to start by going through a wash, and you can put the water on your paper first, or just make sure that your brush is loaded up with lots of water. Your wash is going to be really wet and going to kind of spread around your paper pretty freely. You'll see when it dries that it will make kind of sunbursts, kind of mark wherever it wants to. Next is a dry brush. Just like it sounds, your brush should be dry. It should not be overly wet like the wash. You might need a paper towel to dry your brush off with, so make sure you have that handy. And you'll see that it's kind of like scratchy marks in that section. You can layer paint with this. Just make sure you don't add a lot of water. You can see that I'm making sure that my brush is really dry even when I change my color. There's really not a lot of water on there, and I dried off on the paper towel before I go back to the paper. For your next one, wet on wet, you definitely want to put water on the paper first, and then you put the paint on top of it, and you'll see it spread pretty freely. You can blend colors with this. You can add drops of color into it and see kind of how it dries. Again, it makes like a sunburst. I'll attach my picture of this once it's dry. And you can see that the watercolor just kind of has a mind of its own, but to me that's what's beautiful about watercolor. Test it out, see what you like. Wet and wet is one of my favorite things to use when doing watercolor. When you are starting the salt section, make sure you put a wash, a really wet layer of paint down first. You can do a wet and wet, you can do a blend. Just make sure that that paint is really wet. And then it really doesn't matter what type of salt you use. It can be like the Morton salt, it can be sea salt, it can be the pink salt. Any type of salt works. And you just sprinkle it over top. You're going to wait for it to dry before you wipe it away. It kind of makes these sunbursts and soaks up your water. Next, you need some crayons for the crayon resist. You can draw anything you want. I'm sure you've used this before in elementary school, or if you have dyed eggs before, you've probably used a white wax crayon. Basically, it prevents the dye, or watercolor in this case, from touching the paper. You can't see it that well in here, but white would definitely be ideal if you wanted to use the watercolor resist. It does add just another element and layer to your watercolor piece if you choose to use crayon resist in it. Try out white, try out different colors, see what you like. This is just a practice, so if you don't like it, then you don't have to use it for either final. And the next one, there are 2 ways that you can do the outline. The first way is to lay down the paint first, let it dry, and then go back to it to outline. And the second way would be to outline first, which I'm going to end up showing you at the end, and then fill it in with paint. So first I'm just painting some flower petals, and I'm going to let that dry, and then I'll come back and show you adding outline to it. You can honestly do anything. I think a lot of people like that one, so try that out. For blot, you're going to put a wash of watercolor, and all you need is a paper towel for this one. You're just going to blot on the paper, and it makes a really cool texture. And then the last one is plastic wrap, one of my favorite ones. You just need to make a wash on the paper, make sure it's nice and wet, and then you are going to take a small piece of plastic wrap or saran wrap, and you are going to place it on top and press it into your wet paint. You'll see it kind of forms these little sections, and you want to leave that there until it dries. So I had about 40 minutes pass before I went back and took off the plastic wrap and the tape. So here's the outline. I used a Micron pen, but you can also, as I said before, draw first and then fill in. Really a preference on what you'd like to do. And then as you take your tape off, you can see all of your different things. I just labeled them, and that's about it.